It's like cosplay. It's like, I want to be a military commander, and this is what I've seen in movies and on TV, so it sounds authoritative, right? I think everybody is in over their heads in this government.
Of course.
It's sort of a goat rodeo.
Hello and welcome to the Bulwark Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Miller. First up, it's our friend Michael Weiss, editor of The Insider, a Russia-focused media outlet, contributing editor to New Lines magazine, formerly an investigative reporter for CNN, our unofficial crazy foreign policy correspondent. And we wanted to bring him in immediately because we've now officially seen the text. Michael Weiss, are these war plans? The White House is saying this is a hoax. These are not war plans. What do you make of it?
You've got the timings of the strikes. You've got the platforms being used. There's no way that this was unclassified data, right? I mean, I'm talking to former CIA officers, including a former CIA lawyer, who says this is all top secret. I mean, even more critical than the attack plans themselves is the policy discussion, right? Like, if you're a foreign adversary, you absolutely want to know what the back and forth is amongst Trump's national security team. So the fact that J.D. Vance is a little squeamish about attacking the Houthis because that gives a freebie to the Europeans, those freeloading welfare queen Europeans that he's always on about, that's useful information. So Mark Polymeropoulos said to me, if you're a CIA case officer and you obtain this data on an enemy of the United States, you get a medal, right? That's how valuable this stuff is. So it certainly looks to me, and again, I've just done some very quick reporting on this, thanks to the Atlantic's disclosure. It certainly looks to me like some people went ahead and perjured themselves at Congress yesterday by saying this was all unclassified. Now, it may be the case that Donald Trump has decided to declassify it after the fact, but the chronology of this, what did you know and when kind of thing is going to be key here. So I don't think the story's going away, Tim.
No, Donald Trump declassified it with his mind, apparently. And there's so much here to go over, but just because, the White House is already out this morning saying, these are not war plans. They're still dying on this spin hill, as you mentioned yesterday in Congress. Both Ratcliffe, that of the CIA, and Tulsi, were testifying that this was not classified. Ratcliffe was saying it's pretty concerning, the poor memory on the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He's like, I couldn't remember if they, I cannot recall when asked several times. It's all pretty preposterous. And I just put it in this context. Imagine if, somebody involved in the actual execution of the mission, an actual war fighter, to use Pete Hegseth's term. Let's imagine this person is a DEI hire. Let's imagine this is a black woman, and she decides to text the Atlantic 2 hours ahead the exact timing of when we're going to bomb Yemen. All caps. This is when the first bombs will definitely drop.
I love that.
And by the way, what is Pete Hegseth saying today? What is Pete Hegseth? And then it leaks. What is Pete Hegseth saying about this person? I mean, this person is getting court-martialed.
They're getting fired and they're getting prosecuted, no question. I mean, by the way, I love the Waltz sets the timer for deletion to 4 weeks. I correspond with my dog groomer on Signal, and we have a 3-day time window for deletion. So, Humphrey getting his hair cut is, I guess, less sensitive or more sensitive than when we're bombing the Houthis. I mean, look, this is the Trump administration line is very clear on this, right? Deny, 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 attack, attack, attack. It's kind of the Roy Cohn playbook. There is no question that everybody has egg on their face. There is no question that they realize what a colossal fuck up this is. There is no question in my mind now that people ought to be fired or ought to resign, but they're not going to, right? Because that's just handing a gift to the media and, the big bad wolf, Jeffrey Goldberg, who evidently may have hacked his way. We got Elon Musk, our best man on the case, to figure out if Jeff Goldberg.
Let's sit on this for a second, because I think this is important. Since we talked to Jeff yesterday, since then last night, and again, if anybody that listened to the pod yesterday, had these guys just said, you know what, this was just a total mistake. I meant to put in whatever, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and that was JC, and I wrote JG instead. Who knows? I mean, it would be still a huge egg on your face. But if they had said that, these details don't come out today. And what they did instead was crazy. I just want to play the audio of Michael Waltz last night on Fox, essentially accusing Jeffrey Goldberg of espionage. Let's listen.
How did a Trump-hating editor of The Atlantic end up on your Signal chat?
Laura, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but of all the people out there, somehow this guy who has lied about the president, who has lied to Gold Star families, lied to their attorneys, and gone to Russia hoax, gone to just all kinds of links to lie and smear the president of the United States, and he's the one that somehow gets on somebody's contact and then gets sucked into this group. Have you ever had somebody's contact that shows their name and then you have somebody else's number there?
I never make those mistakes.
Right? You got somebody else's number on someone else's contact. So of course I didn't see this loser in the group. It looked like someone else. Now whether he did it deliberately or it happened in some other technical mean is something we're trying to figure out.
Whether he did it deliberately. And that's the National Security Advisor.
He got sucked in to a Signal chat that you have to be added to by a member of the chat.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
The question is whether he did it deliberately. I mean, Michael, do they think that is better spin? I guess it's because they hate the media so much, and like he can't, he's worried that he's going to be accused of being like a secret deep state neocon inside the administration. So that's why he has to do this. But like, that is worse, right? If the idea that it's like, oh, some boomer magazine editor hacked his way into the chat where we planned our bombing campaign. That's
right. So they're accusing him, or he is floating a conspiracy theory, a slanderous one, that Jeff Goldberg has committed espionage.
Yes,
and which is a crime.
Very
so this is their spin, right? That Jeff is a criminal, and that's how he obtained this. But look, the critical thing here is nobody is disputing the authenticity of these communications, right?
Right.
So that we have documentary proof, we have screenshots of the Signal chats. So what'll happen now is, I hope these guys will be brought back before Congress, before the Senate, and grilled and told there is no way that this stuff was not classified, right? You can FOIA this, by the way, now. And if it turns out that Tulsi Gabbard and Hegseth and Waltz perjured themselves, well, in the long ago, Tim, that was a crime punishable by prosecution and jail. And I don't think the DOJ in this administration is going to do anything like that, but
we're worried about Tesla vandals. I want to get your take on one other, and maybe some of the folks you've talked to. I don't know if this has bubbled up in any chats you've said, but just me as somebody who's not involved, has never been involved in any like military type conversations like this. The Pete Hegseth just kind of tone on this chat really jumps out to me. I mean, on the one, just like all caps, this is when the first bombs will definitely drop, followed by we are currently clean on OPSEC. When like there's an unknown number on the line is pretty funny as far as incompetence is concerned. But just over and over, calling the Europeans pathetic, all caps, saying he loathes them, sharing maybe more information than he needs to with like the Secretary of Treasury, like all the people on this chain, being very solicitous. To me, it reads like somebody that like knows he's in over his head and is trying really hard to demonstrate competence, and it totally backfired.
A friend of mine put it well. He said this sort of reads like he's in a direct-to-video Steven Seagal film where Seagal is spending 90% of the film because he's so obese in a chair, like barking orders. I mean, it's written in crayon. It's like cosplay. It's like, I want to be a military commander, and this is what I've seen in movies and on TV, so it sounds authoritative, right? I mean, I think everybody is in over their heads in this government.
Of course.
It's sort of a goat rodeo. But yes, I mean, why? First of all, let's take a step back here. There's some other contextual things that need to be discussed. Number one, you're not supposed to have Signal on your private devices communicating with other members of the national security team. Like, that's just a cardinal rule. In fact, former CIA people told me that the CIA messaged out, here's what you need to be aware of with Signal and its vulnerabilities. That's one. This idea that Ratcliffe installed Signal on his computer at the agency the day he took the job. No, I mean, this is just insane. Number two, Tulsi Gabbard was abroad when these messages were going back and forth. I think she was in India. Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy to, I guess, everything now, was in Russia with Signal on his phone in Russia at the time that these chats were taking place. Now, if you use Wi-Fi, if you have Bluetooth turned on in Russia, and you're somebody like Steve Witkoff, whom the Russians are very interested in finding out who's he talking to and what is the nature and content of those conversations.
I mean, I sense you'd think the Russians would be interested in that, but since Steve Witkoff is saying everything that Dmitry Peskov would say in all of his interviews, maybe they don't really need to work him. But
maybe they got some pretty good insights into how to psychologically manipulate this guy as a result of hacking his phone. I mean, everything about this is just radioactively stupid. And just the sort of cardinal rules: do not do this if you're in a position of authority and you have top secret clearance, which all of these people do. So
just
yeah,
on the phone thing. Also, Tulsi's asked about this in the hearing yesterday,
mm-hmm.
and I just body language, Tim, doctor, like she looked nervous to me, and she was very uncomfortable. I mean, Ratcliffe was like kind of new to their bone and kind of had a lying smirk on his face a little bit. She looked like she was sweating. And Jack Reed, the Democratic senator from Rhode Island, was pressing her on whether she was on her personal phone or not, whether she was overseas. And she was like, oh, well, we need to wait for a review to look at that. And he's like, what is the review? Like, were you on your phone or not? So, and clearly the director of national intelligence was on her personal phone also overseas, in addition to Witkoff being in Russia.
And, look, I don't know how many devices Tulsi Gabbard has had, if she still has the phone that she had before she was DNI. But this is somebody who has traveled to the Vatican, a trip paid for by a foundation headed by a Belgian businessman, Pierre Louvrier, who is a Russian intelligence asset. There's literally photographs of him with Igor Girkin, the FSB colonel and war criminal who led the separatist movement in Ukraine during the first invasion in 2014, right? And Louvrier is like, just a Google search of this guy's social. My partner and colleague Christo Grozev did a deep dive investigation into him. Is he in the phone
her sponsor? Too? He was on her sponsor. On
his foundation paid for the trip. This is why she was. The New York Times did a story about she was flagged in her international travel. It's because of that trip. I mean, the Russians are doing all kinds of shady things in the Vatican. Don't ask me why. It's like the new Vienna for them. But,
it's probably easy to get compromised inside the Vatican.
Well, maybe why. Hey, I've seen Conclave, so I get it. But so does she have him in the contacts? Has he had access to her phone? These are all kinds of questions that, even before you get into a counterintelligence sort of frame of mind, you have to be asking and wondering. And yeah, she looked deeply, deeply uncomfortable. Her apologists and defenders, when she was nominated for this position, I mean, their kind of fallback on, well, no, it's total McCarthyist claptrap that she's a Russian asset and she's this, was that, well, she's just not very bright. That's why she's regurgitating RT talking points on Syria and all that. Oh, okay, so she's not terribly bright, but let's put her in a position of oversight of the entire U.S. intelligence community.
And then she nominates, like in the Signal chat, two other things that struck me, and then I want to get into the Russia sanctions news too. But the chain begins with Waltz asking everybody to add somebody to be a representative for them on the chain. Mm-hmm. She puts on Joe Kent, who's this guy that ran for Congress, who's a total kook, who is like sidling up to white nationalist youth. He was like begging for the support of the white nationalist Groypers. He's advanced some pro-Russian views. He's obviously an election denier. They all are. So he's her point person. So it's not like she has nominated somebody who's like an old hand intelligence person to kind of guide her through this. And then you got the VP, when Waltz explains what happens in like a brief summary and the chain.
He's like, what?
He's like, what are you talking about? Like, he doesn't understand like basic terminology. And it's just, it's really I mean, the Keystone Cops is like too nice.
Yeah, no, I mean, the insights that you get from this, apart from, as I say, the policy back and forth, who thinks what, and the kind of kit that's being brought to bear. Also, by the way, there was battle damage assessment, right? When was it Waltz or Hegseth says, the building collapsed and we got, the Houthi missile guys going into his girlfriend. That's easy to piece together, like who the target was, right? So that's also valuable intelligence. But you just get a sense, if you're a hostile state or a foreign adversary, that these people don't know what they're doing and that they're deeply, deeply insecure, like in the literal sense of the word, that they're easily infiltrated. And that's also, I mean, a windfall, because then like I just have to shadow the national security advisor or his staff and, get to know these people. And I mean, they've got classified on their personal devices. I mean, that's great insight into how the United States government is being run. And then, added to which what Jeff told you yesterday, which is that a CIA officer's name was mentioned in the chat. I mean, Ratcliffe's chief of staff, I think it's now been reported. Whether or not that was somebody undercover or it doesn't matter. You still don't do that kind of thing.
So we've already accidentally released like the first name and last initial of CIA agents already.
Look at you, man, doing the Russians work for them on your own podcast.
So anyway, all right, let's talk about the Russians. So Trump has agreed. I covered with Bill Kristol on Monday, if people missed it, at great length, the Steve Witkoff just useful idiot spin on behalf of Russia, just straight down the line. Our man in Amsterdam is like at best just extremely gullible. It's the best thing that you could say, maybe actively working against our allies. And then we've got this deal here. Peter Baker, Trump agrees to start lifting sanctions on Russia even without getting the full 30-day ceasefire he had proposed. He accepted a limited halt to strikes in the Black Sea and on power plants, and some lengthy then discussion about all of the now access to markets that Russia is going to have and the lifting of certain sanctions. Meanwhile, I think I don't quite get this. I want you to explain it to me. Like, military analysts are talking about how it really benefits, like the Black Sea ceasefire particularly benefits Russia. Phillips O'Brien, a military analyst, has a great Substack post where he's arguing that they basically put Ukraine in a box where Russia is now getting economic relief and a military advantage out of this deal. What do you make of it?
Yeah, so on the sanctions side of the ledger, remember Donald Trump said if Russia doesn't come to the table or abide by a ceasefire, we're just going to sanction the hell out of them. That was his tough guy, his one or two moments of appearing or posturing as a tough guy in Russia. Well, what the Russians are doing, and Putin specifically is doing, is dragging out this process of negotiating, a truce, whatever you want to call it, and adding new conditions and caveats to it. So now the Russians are saying, well, actually, in order to get us to do a maritime ceasefire, you have to lift some sanctions on our agricultural exports and also, critically, reconnect the Russian Agricultural Bank to SWIFT, the international banking system. Yeah. Now, the nice thing about that is that doesn't get done without the European Union's consent. And the EU votes by consensus. And they're not set to vote until the summer, July, August, right? Just before coming on your show, the European Commission came out and said, no, the only way we amend or change or lift sanctions is Russia full withdrawal from Ukraine, right? So it's a very strong, solid statement. So the Europeans have, to use the metaphor of the hour, the cards to play here to,
so if they don't get SWIFT, what then do they get access to?
Well, the U.S. can start to lift sanctions unilaterally, but the EU can do secondary sanctions. So it doesn't have the full impact. If the EU keeps in place its sanctions on the same institutions, that tends to constrain or limit Russia's ability to do business. But to the point that Phillips is raising, and I made this point myself, one of the unsung victories for the Ukrainians in the last couple of years has been to drive the bulk of the Black Sea fleet out of Crimea. They're based in Sevastopol. Through drone attacks, missile attacks, including with ATACMS that we've provided them with their own homegrown or homemade Neptune cruise missiles. They've expended a lot of resources doing this. And it's also allowed them to create an alternate route for their own grain shipments, right? I mean, the Black Sea Fleet imposed a blockade, and that completely circumscribed Ukraine's ability to make money by selling its food on the international market. So the question is, if this maritime ceasefire does come into effect, and already there's some issues in terms of the readouts on either side and what conditions have been agreed or not, does that mean the Black Sea Fleet is able to return in its entirety to Crimea? Because that furthers Russia's military occupation of southern Ukraine. And if the Russians are allowed to do that, well, where does it say that the Ukrainians are able to move their personnel or their military assets to places where they currently are not on the battlefield? So yes, it is very one-sided. The Ukrainians will say, well, look, the best thing that we can get out of this is fewer restrictions on our ability to export, assuming that the Russians abide by any agreement and don't open fire on our commercial vessels, and a cessation of bombings of the port in Odessa, for instance. So, well, but the Russians being the Russians, they're going to muck about. They're probably going to use their own commercial vessels to transport weapons and material, because they do that anyway. And as far as things going boom, I mean, they can still bomb you, and they'll just say, well, that's the Ukrainians bombing themselves, doing false flags and trying to blame it on Moscow. And knowing Donald Trump, he'll probably believe Putin's word over his own intelligence community.
Sure, or not technically the same, the part not covered by the limited ceasefire. Trump, it was interesting. Trump was on Newsmax last night. I'm going to spare people the audio of his voice, but he's talking to Greg Kelly, who's maybe the craziest Newsmax anchor, which is competitive category. And Kelly asked him, had a rare moment of lucidity, and asked him about Russia dragging their feet. Trump said, I don't know if they are. I mean, I'll let you know at a certain point, but I think that Russia wants to see an end to it, but it could be they're dragging their feet. I've done it over the years, I don't want to sign a contract. I want to sort of stay in the game, but maybe I don't want to do it quite. I'm not sure. And he goes on to say that he's encouraged by the fact that Russia had surrounded the Ukrainian troops and that they didn't kill all of them, and that he gets credit for that.
Yeah, which never happened. The Ukrainian troops were not encircled in Kursk. The Ukrainian military has been quite clear about this. Our own military has come out and said this is not the case. Our own intelligence community has come out and said this is not the case. But he maintains that this is happening. And the only people who claim that this is happening are the Russians and Putin in particular, right? And, this idea that, the way that Vladimir is thinking is just the way I was thinking, as a real estate developer.
As a shady real estate developer.
Just the tough negotiations in the closing room and all this. No. And this is the problem with Steve Witkoff. You have these sort of tender-headed outer borough, goombas who made a lot of money in developing properties in New York and beyond, or the Middle East in Witkoff's case. And they think that they have found their equal in a Russian dictator who was trained as a KGB case officer. And I mean, this is terrifying to me. Witkoff, he sort of reminds me of Armand Hammond, the industrialist, the pharmaceuticals guy in the 1920s who became so besotted.
I thought you were talking about Armie Hammer.
Armie Hammer Armie Hammer is related to that family. Yeah. But these guys were,
he was like eating the flesh of the women though, So I was like, that's pretty.
Before that, his great-grandfather was known as Lenin's favorite capitalist. So this is the guy who essentially enabled the Soviets and the Cheka, which is the forerunner to the KGB, to do money laundering and to move things into the West when there was no diplomatic recognition. This guy does not have any kind of independence of mind anymore. He is not curious. He is not skeptical. He is not critically minded when it comes to what the Russians are telling him. He goes to Moscow, Putin releases this American school teacher as a goodwill gesture and dazzles him, charms him, makes him think that this is the best friend he's been waiting for his entire life. I mean, he's literally said, we have a great relationship, and I think he's behaving and acting in good faith, all of which is not true, of course, but he has convinced himself. And so, again, let's go to what the kind of MAGA fallback position is here. People will say, well, yeah, it's Russian talking points, but he's just being clever. He's flattering Putin to get Putin to do things that we want him to do, right? This is tough negotiation. No, he sincerely believes what he's being sold. And I mean, on whose behalf is he really negotiating now? He sounds like Russia's special envoy.
Yeah, and Putin hasn't given us anything. And this is part of the reason why Trump, I think, has to flatter himself with the idea that he saved the surrounded Kursk soldiers, because it's like, we're not actually making Putin give anything up. The Ukrainians haven't gotten anything yet out of this whole deal. So if you create a fake story where you saved a bunch of Ukrainians, that's how you even the imaginary ledger. So just one more thing. Yeah, just you can answer that, but just before I lose you, last thing is that there's a kind of a tie between these two stories. That the Russians have been supportive of the Houthis, and I do think it's that adds to kind of the absurdity of it all, that Witkoff was in Russia. So anyway,
not just supporting the Houthis, but providing them with targeting data to go after commercial vessels in the region, according to the Wall Street Journal. So, yes, I mean, Russia has a strategic relationship with Iran, which is the patron of the Houthis, which has armed the Houthis and propped them up. So, this is the kind of weird sort of dynamic, I guess, that's taking place in Trump world, which is they're very pro-Israel. They want to get tough on Iran, threaten to bomb the hell out of Iran's nuclear program, go after Hamas, go after Hezbollah, go after the Houthis, put the onus on Iran. But they don't want to hear that doing that sort of upsets the apple cart with their new best friends, the Russians, right? Or they've managed to kind of keep these two ledgers separate. And, it reminds me, frankly, of term one, when that great strategic genius, Michael Flynn, I mean, his grand design was exactly this: to separate, to cleave the Tehran away from Moscow, and for us to befriend the Russians to do counterterrorism jointly. And we all saw how that worked out. Yeah, but fundamentally, the Russians don't care that much about their allies and partners. We've seen this now in Syria, right? I mean, Putin kind of shrugged when Bashar al-Assad's regime didn't even crumble; it just evaporated. And now he's trying to do deals with HTS, the new government in Damascus, to keep the Russian military infrastructure in place there. So the Russians have no problem throwing their own friends under the bus. They do this all the time. But the biggest strategic objective that they have is to get the United States to do this realignment, right? Abandon our allies in Europe, abandon the Ukrainians, and basically be open for business with the Russians, and frankly, invite their intelligence officers back to American soil, which is what Marco Rubio is more or less saying when he says we're going to start reopening their embassies and consulates here.
Well, hopefully they're too incompetent to achieve their goals of our rapprochement with Russia. I guess that's the best thing we've got working for us right now. All right. Thank you, Michael Weiss. I should just say, my friend Jamie Kirchick wrote a very in-depth piece on the Army Hammer cannibalism accusations, and they were overstated. And I don't mean to kink shame on here, so I apologize to Army. Armand Hammer seems like was a little credulous, his grandfather, but Army, I think maybe got the brunt of some bad.
Well, the whole Hammer family going back into the 20s and 30s, just deeply, deeply compromised by the Soviets. So yeah, Army. I mean, hey, I thought he was the star in what was that movie that
Call Me by Your Name?
Yeah, I thought he was better than Timothée, but
okay, Michael, you're not going to be invited back on the pod if we have any Timothy slander. No Chalamet slander on the pod. All right, everybody, that's Michael Weiss. He'll be back soon. Crazy shit's happening every week.